Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Princeton Review live stream for the AP US History exam. My name is Gina Donegan. I'm a longtime teacher for the Princeton Review, and I'm here to give you lots of tips and tricks to help you to be successful on the AP this year. This is our final video in a three-part series on the AP US History test. So if you're joining me from one of our other sessions, welcome back. We're going to talk about all the additional things you need to know. If you're just joining me for the first time, then you're welcome to join on in and I'll bring you up to speed. So first of all, we're just going to quickly review some of the basics. There are 3 dates in which you will be taking the AP US History exam this year. You might be taking it on Thursday, May 6th. And if that's the case, then you'll definitely be taking a paper and pencil test. But you might also be taking the test on Wednesday, May 19th, or even Wednesday, June 2nd. So if that's the case, you'll actually be taking either a paper and pencil test or a digital test. And the digital test might be taken on a school computer at school, or it's even possible that you might be taking the AP online at home, depending on what your school has chosen. So, in our first session, I went through a lot of good detail about the differences between the paper and pencil test and the digital test. So if you happen to miss that one, you might want to go back and catch up because there are some important differences in both the content that's being tested and in some of the rules for how the paper test and the digital exam might work. And find out from your teacher when you're taking the test and in what format you'll be taking it so that you'll be sure to be prepared. So in last night's session, we spent a lot of time talking about the essays, and we specifically focused on the DBQ, document-based question, and the LEQ, long essay question. Tonight, we're going to focus a little bit more on the short answer questions because, as you may know, there are going to be a lot of them. You'll have at least 3 short answer questions. That's if you're taking the paper test. But if you're taking the digital test, you'll actually have a total of 5 short answer questions. So it's actually a pretty important part of the test. So we're going to talk about good strategies for approaching the short answer questions. And we'll also take a look at some multiple choice questions and just some of the ways you can use good process of elimination for those. If you have any questions as we go along, I would definitely encourage you to type those into the chat field. We have a fairly small group tonight, so we can talk about just about anything you want. So don't be shy. If you have anything to say or comment or question, just let me know. So remember, too, that a good resource for you between now and test day will be the AP Central page at collegeboard.org. You can get to all the relevant AP pages by going to apstudent.collegeboard.org. So if you're taking multiple AP tests, this is a one-stop shop. And the US History exam has its own page with lots of information. Information about what's going to be on the test, also practice essay questions, sample student essays. There's a ton of material on there. If you haven't already checked that out, you'll want to. So let's dive into a little bit more information about short answer questions. This is actually a very important part of the test because every AP exam will have short answer questions. If you're taking the paper test, you'll have 3 of them. And these come at the end of the multiple choice section. So it's actually part of section 1 of the test. If you're taking it on paper and pencil, the first 2 prompts will be required prompts, but the last essay that you write will actually involve a choice between 2, which is kind of nice. If you're taking the digital exam, you have no choices. Unfortunately, you just have to respond to whichever 3 prompts they give you. And if you're taking the digital exam, you'll have 2 more of these that come after the DBQ. So you'll actually have a total of 5 if you're taking the digital test. So unlike the other essays that have fairly complicated scoring rubrics, the short answer questions don't have a complex scoring rubric. Basically, the way it works is each prompt has 3 related questions. If you answer those questions to the grader's satisfaction, you will earn a point for each one. So basically, you could score a 1, 2, or 3 on the short answer question, depending on how reliably you answer those questions. And you obviously have to demonstrate historically accurate content knowledge. And that's really what they're testing you on, right? Is how well do you understand that period in history or that issue that they're asking you about? You need to write in a clear manner and also a fairly concise manner because you don't have a lot of time to answer these. You have a total of 40 minutes to write 3 short answer questions. So that means we need to move along and write in a fairly succinct manner. We need to answer the questions, but we don't have the luxury of spending a lot of time doing it. So a lot of people will write the short answer essay in about 1 or 2 paragraphs. Possibly 3 paragraphs, but for a lot of people, it might be tough to write that much in a short amount of time. So keep it simple because it's better to get through all 3 of the questions and score points for all of them rather than, write too much on one issue and run out of time. You need to describe the relevant characteristics of a specified topic. So that just means background information. And you always want to think about how or why a historical development, process, or relationship exists. So, whatever it is they're asking you about, think about the context. That's called contextualization. And also think about the how or why. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some examples of some sample short answer prompts and also some sample essays. So you can see some examples of what good short answer essays sound like. First of all, the questions that they ask you will almost always be based on some sort of source material, like a short paragraph, which is a quote from a book or a historical document or a speech. And sometimes they even like to give you non text sources like pictures, maps, cartoons, charts and graphs, that sort of thing. Sometimes you'll even have 2 short quotes put together. This one happens to be what we call a secondary source, and that's just a book written about a historical event from the past. So it wasn't taken from that time period, but it's taken from a historian who is educated about that time period. So obviously, we need to read the source and then think about the question that's being asked or the 3 questions that are being asked. So this one says, convinced that the revolution was the work of a full few miscreants who had rallied an armed rabble to their cause, they expected that the revolutionaries would be intimidated. Then the vast majority of Americans who were loyal but cowed by the terroristic tactics would rise up, kick out the rebels, and restore loyal government in each colony. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't tell us exactly what war he's talking about, but we can figure it out from some of these context clues, right? I mean, first of all, it says the revolution, so we must be talking about the American Revolution. We're not talking about the French Revolution. That wouldn't make any sense. And an armed rabble. Who was the armed rabble? Well, those must have been people like the Sons of Liberty and, all the revolutionaries who fought in New England, especially. And then it talks about the vast majority of Americans who were loyal. Well, maybe Britain thought so, right? But, the question is, were they loyal to the end? Probably not. Terroristic tactics. Okay, that's maybe how the British would have viewed the actions of those who were fought the revolution. And they call them rebels. And here's the big tip off: colonies, right? So we're definitely talking about the American Revolution. So now let's look at the questions that are being asked. Question A, briefly explain one example of rebellion during the time period described in Black's quote. Well, this is kind of interesting because we know he's talking about the revolution, but what they seem to be asking for is something a little more specific, like a specific rebellion that happened, maybe not during the revolution, but maybe before. Briefly explain one cause of the rebellion you chose. And then C, briefly explain one effect of the rebellion you chose. So this is really common for them to ask about causes and effects. And so the first thing you want to do here is just go to your scratch paper if you're taking the digital test, or if you're taking the paper and pencil test, just jot some things down on your page or in the margin. Just kind of write down all the ideas that come into your head in connection with this uh, period of time. And specifically, they're asking about a rebellion. So that's what we want to try to come up with. So, um, if I were to sit down and sort of make a little memorize or a little brainstorming list here are the things I might think of. I might think of the East India Tea Company, the Boston Tea Party, which was a reaction to what was going on in the tea trade, the Sons of Liberty, who were the ones that organized the Boston Tea Party. And then, okay, if we have to think of effects, then there were the intolerable acts that came after the Boston Tea Party and the closing of Boston Harbor. Now, there might have been other things here. Obviously, I'm focusing on the Boston Tea Party, but you might have thought of the Stamp Act, the Townsend Revenue Act, the Sugar Act. But, honestly, in my mind, those things aren't as obvious when it comes to a rebellion, right? The Boston Tea Party seems like the most obvious rebellion to me, so that's the one that I would write about. So always go with the path of least resistance, right? Even if you think the Boston Tea Party is a little too obvious, that's okay. You're still answering the question. You're still going to get a point for it. You don't have to be super creative. Write about what you know. So once you kind of do your brainstorming list, then you're ready to write, and you want to make sure that you address all three of the questions. So let's take a look at an example essay that was written on this topic, and we'll see if the author does a good job of answering all the questions, and we'll decide whether this would get a maximum score. So the first sentence says, under the principle of mercantilism, so notice that this person is throwing in some good background knowledge about the topic, Britain frequently put the interests of its corporations ahead of the interests of American colonists. The Tea Act of 1773. Now, this person happened to know the exact date of the Tea Act, but it's okay if you don't, right? You don't have to use a ton of dates. It's not required. But if you do know a date, by all means, you can throw it in there. Was an attempt to force colonists to purchase tea from the East India Company rather than from cheaper sources. This hurt many colonial merchants, so the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Indians, initiated the Boston Tea Party. So far, this person has thrown a lot of good key terms in here, right? Mercantilism, the Tea Act, East India Tea Company, Sons of Liberty, Boston Tea Party. It's just loaded with good information. The protesters boarded company ships and dumped many pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. So this means the person knows what the Boston Tea Party was about, thus sending a message to the king that his economic tactics were not welcome. Now, what do we have there? We have an answer to the question, which is what the rebellion is. That's question A. We've also answered question B, which is causes. So hopefully we're going to see effects in paragraph 2. Let's check it out. The king did not ignore the Boston Tea Party. Governor George Grenville implemented the Intolerable Acts, which were designed to punish Massachusetts for its willful spirit and included such harsh measures as closing the port of Boston and requiring the quartering of soldiers in private homes. Little did Grenville realize that the people of Massachusetts would soon become instrumental in the defeat of British rule in North America. So what do we have there? We have the ultimate effect of the Boston Tea Party, which was the actual revolution. So this is a great example of a short answer essay because it answers all of the questions, it includes plenty of facts, and it's actually written in a pretty good style. Now, you might look at this and you might say, well, it'd be kind of hard for me to pull this off in, 10 or 12 minutes. Maybe. I'm not saying you have to be quite this fancy in order to score well on the short answer questions. But you do absolutely need to answer the questions. You need to answer them with some facts, and you need to write in a decent style, right? So this person certainly pulls it off. Now let's take a look at another one. And remember, for those of you taking the paper and pencil test, you will have the ability to choose between questions 3 and 4. You're not writing four short answer questions. You're only writing 3. So the first 2 are mandatory, but the last 2 give you the choice of one or the other. The best thing to do here is obviously choose the questions or the time period that is most relevant to your knowledge base. And the 2 questions will come from 2 completely different periods of time. So, for example, this one says confine your response to the period from 1600 to 1800. So that's a broad period of time, but that means you also have a lot of leeway to answer the question the way you want based on that time period. So here, question A says briefly describe one specific historical difference between the types of people who settled and colonized New England and those who settled the South. Question B, briefly describe one specific historical similarity between the types of people who settled and colonized New England and those who settled the South. So notice question A is a difference, question B is a similarity, and now question C. Briefly describe one specific historical effect of the differences between the types of people who settled and colonized New England and those who settled the South. So this one obviously requires us to know about the colonists, North versus South, differences, similarities, and a historical effect of some kind. Now let's compare that with question 4. Maybe question 4 will be closer to your knowledge base, maybe not. So here we have question A. Briefly describe one specific historical difference between the immigration policies of the United States in the period 1920 to 1965 and the immigration policies in the period 1965 to the present. Question B, one specific historical similarity between the immigration policies of 1920 to 1965 and 1965 to the present. And then question C, one specific historical impact of the immigration policies in either time period. So notice how questions 3 and 4 were structured in almost the same way. Neither one of them had a source text. That's okay. Some of them don't have a source text, some of them do. Just kind of depends on what the College Board decides to do. But notice both of them were asking about similarities, differences, and then effects, right? The first question said effect, this one says impact. That's pretty much the same thing. So your decision will be which one of these time periods or which one of these issues do I know more about? Choose that one. And so, you have to choose fast. Well, let's say you decided, okay, I think I know a little bit more about the colonists because we covered that at the beginning of our course, and it's sort of sealed in my head because I had to write papers, I had to take tests. The immigration thing might be a little more foggy, especially if your AP class is a little behind in terms of chronology. So if you decide to choose New England colonies versus Southern colonies, keep in mind that New England is a pretty clearly defined region, right? But the South could be a little squishy, right? Like, let's say you know a lot about the Chesapeake region. Well, you could even sort of call that South, right? Some people think of Maryland and Virginia as kind of the South. And so you don't necessarily need to write about Georgia if you don't know anything about that. Take a moment to brainstorm. Write down everything you can think of about North versus South. So, for example, what are the similarities? Well, both of these groups of people from 1600 to 1800 were mostly Protestant. You didn't have many Catholic immigrants until, say, the 1800s. But you did have Maryland. Okay, Maryland was Catholic. But what are their religious differences? Well, the Puritans in New England certainly had different beliefs from, say, the Presbyterians or other kinds of Protestants in the South. Why did people settle New England? Largely for religious freedom, But in the South, it came down to making some money, right? Growing cash crops like tobacco and so forth. And obviously, they had the widespread use of indentured servants and slaves. Indentured servants when you're closer to 1600, slaves when you get closer to 1800. Um, Both the North and the South maintained cultural separation from the Indians. New England had more early conflict with the Indians, made more of an attempt to convert them to Christianity. So that could be a difference. New England had a different form of government, more of a direct government, town meeting style democracy, not so much in the South. They both worked under the system of mercantilism. You had joint stock companies in the South, specifically Jamestown. And of course, both of these groups had a strong British identity. So you're basically just writing down anything that could relate to the similarities or the differences. Now, what about question C? Question C was about historical impact or effects. Well, here again, we can just think about the revolution, right? That was one effect. Um, but later on down the road, we could also start to get into conflicts around slavery. Now, we do have to confine our answer to things that happened between 1600 and 1800. So we wouldn't want to be talking about the Civil War here. But there were conflicts on the issue of slavery at the drafting of the Constitution. So that could work. There were also differences when it came to the French and Indian War and even things like the Northwest Ordinance. Now, I've got a lot of things written on my slide. I'm not necessarily saying that you would write down all of these things when you're brainstorming. You don't have to. If you can just write down 2, 3, or 5 things, that's perfectly fine. But the idea is sometimes by just writing things down, it leads to better ideas. You can actually come up with more ideas by writing them down. Don't just sort of stare at the wall and panic, right? That's not a good plan. Grab your pencil and start writing things down on your scratch paper if you're taking the digital test, or if you're taking a paper and pencil test. Remember, you can write in the test booklet. So once you come up with your ideas, then write your essay. Now, this one happens to be one paragraph. It's a pretty long paragraph. So I don't mean to say you have to write this much for the short answer question, but this person is a fast writer and this person wrote a lot. So let's take a look. It says the English started to emigrate to the New World in the early 1600s. There we have contextualization, right? We know what was happening during this time period. The first successful colony was Jamestown, Virginia. Excellent. And we even know it was 1607 and a joint stock company. Not too long after, the Pilgrims and Puritans settled the Massachusetts Bay Area. So right now we're focused on New England in order to seek religious freedom. From then on, the New England colonies and the colonies from the Chesapeake South, so this person has decided to kind of go loose with the South, right, and talk about the Chesapeake, were characterized by cultural and economic differences. Okay, now hopefully the author is going to tell us what those differences are. While New Englanders were largely subsistence farmers and merchants who had left England to seek religious and political freedom, the colonists in southern areas were either wealthy farmers, agricultural investors, or at the bottom of society, indentured servants and slaves. So there we have the differences. So we've answered question B, but remember, we also need to talk about similarities. Let's see what else this author has to say. Though most of the colonists in the North and the South were Protestant Christians, the Pilgrims and Puritans were more devout, perhaps even more radical in their vision of a perfect Christian society. John Winthrop's admonition to Puritan society to establish themselves as a city upon a hill would not have been delivered by a tobacco farmer whose goals were more mercenary. Good use of vocabulary here, right? Despite religious differences, though, okay, so far this person has been really focused on differences. We need to get to the similarities. Though almost all colonists in the North and South had a strong sense of themselves as English citizens, so there's a similarity. Loyalty to the crown persisted in both regions. There's a similarity. These loyalties were tested later, though, when the differences between New England and the remaining colonies became more apparent. Talk of revolution began in independent Massachusetts, while many loyalists in the South were uncomfortable with the notion of risking trading partnerships with England. So notice at the very end here, the person has answered the third question. So I think if I were critiquing this essay, I would say, well, maybe you spent too much effort on differences, right? And maybe your essay didn't need to be this long. Maybe you should have spent equal time on similarities, differences, and answering the third question. But once again, this person has written a great essay, right? So both of these essays would earn the full 3 points for answering the questions. And bear in mind, if you think these essays are a little bit longer or fancier than what you can pull off, it's not a problem. It's just an example of what can be done if you really know your time periods and you're focused on answering the questions. And obviously, you have to be able to write quickly. My guess is those of you who are doing the digital test may actually be able to write longer essays because you'll be typing instead of handwriting. So, once again, if you have any specific questions for me, just feel free to type those into the chat field and I can answer any questions that you might have. We're now going to spend some time on the multiple choice part of the test. This is the one thing that we haven't discussed as much, but it's certainly an important part of the test because it accounts for almost half of your AP score. Now, the good news about the AP US History test is that the questions are not going to just ask you for little nitpicky things that you have to sit down and memorize diligently. That's not really what this test is about. They're really testing you on your ability to read a source because all of the questions are tied to either primary sources, secondary sources, or non text style sources. You'll have 2 to 5 questions associated with each one of these sources. So you really have 2 tasks. You have to read and understand the source, but you do also have to have a historical knowledge of whatever the source is discussing. So it's not enough to just read and do a kind of reading comprehension thing. You also have to know a little something about it. But here's the cool thing. Some of the questions actually can be answered just by kind of reading the source carefully. And even when you don't have precise historical knowledge, you can almost always eliminate something just based on a little common sense or whatever knowledge you do have. So overall, I would say the multiple choice questions are nice because if you're just reading carefully, you can pick up points just based on what you read. But to get a top score, if you really want to get a 5, you do have to learn a lot of material. And we talked in class 1 about ways you can organize your notes so that you can learn all this material by test day. You have 55 questions to answer in 55 minutes. Not a lot of time, so time management is going to be really important. Remember, if you're taking the digital exam, you must answer all the questions in order. But if you're taking the paper and pencil test, you do have the freedom to skip around, and that may be a wise thing to do, especially if you tend to run out of time in this section. And also remember that the multiple choice questions are the first thing that you do on the exam, so you've got to be ready to go. Primary sources are original materials. I find that most of the source texts are primary sources, but they may also provide you with some secondary sources too. There's a little bit of a mix, but more of them tend to be primary sources. The cool thing is you might have actually read some of these primary sources in your AP history class. So that's a good thing. You may already be familiar with it, but you should still reread it just to make sure that you're focused on the specific part of the text that they're really testing you on, because it will only be about a paragraph or two. It's not going to be a really long document. And so you want to make sure you're basing your answers on what is in that particular source, not just on your outside knowledge about the source. So, for example, you might have had to read George Washington's farewell address in class. Well, that's pretty long and it covers a lot of major topics, but they may only be quoting part of the address. They may not be testing you on everything that he said. So do read whatever they give you. So let's take a look at an example of the kind of primary source that they might attach to multiple choice questions. And I always think it's a good idea to read the little note at the bottom first, so that you know where the source came from. Like this is a quote from President John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address, 1961. So let's read through it. And it's not a bad idea to highlight anything that you think might be important or underline it as you go along. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort? In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I didn't use my best Boston accent there, but you wouldn't want to hear it. So, this is a famous speech, right? But what's interesting is we hear this line all the time from John F. Kennedy, but we don't really think about what the context is. And here they're giving us a little more context. Now, what's a little sneaky is we don't know exactly what he's talking about, but we have some clues, right? It says, forging against enemies, a global alliance, defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger, our country and all who serve it, right? So it sounds like war, but then again, I don't know if there was really a war going on in 1961. So let's see if we can take a look at the question and do a little process of elimination. And somebody asked a good question in the chat field. So let me just answer that first. Is the 55 minutes for the multiple choice questions only a recommendation, or can you use the 105 minutes of section 1 and theoretically divide the time how you wish? That's a really good question. Let's see. I think the way it works is, I know the way it works is section 1 and section 2 are separated. So you're not just kind of working the whole test at your own pace. I think what you're asking is about the short answer questions, right? I'm pretty sure there's a cutoff of 55 minutes for the multiple choice, and then you have to move on to those short answer questions. You know what? You can check on that with your teacher, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct about that. So multiple choice is separate from the essays. But for the short answer questions, that block of 40 minutes can be used in any way you want. And I think the reason why they do that is just to prevent people from, using up all the time on multiple choice, which would not be a good thing. Okay, so we've read our John F. Kennedy quote. Now let's take a look at the kind of question that they might ask you about this. Now, keep in mind, these questions might not be worded exactly in the same way that the College Board would word them, but it just gives you an idea of how they might test you on the source quote. So this question says, the excerpt provided discusses global turbulence and the desire for freedom of mankind in reference to which of the following events? The first thing you should always do is think about the era in history. Okay, we know that that quote came from 1961. So when you look at the answers, you should be able to eliminate some answers that are simply outside of that time period. For example, the women's suffrage movement was not in 1961. Okay, women got the right to vote in 1919, so that's way outside of the time period. So we could definitely cross off answer B. And you probably know that the Great Depression was not in this time period either. The Great Depression was in the 1930s. So that can't be right. Now, the other two choices are kind of close because the civil rights movement was getting going in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And certainly the Cold War was a factor after World War II, all the way up until the 1980s. So either one of these could look right. And the desire for freedom, well, that could sound like the civil rights movement. But what about global turbulence? That doesn't exactly seem like the civil rights movement. And again, if we go back to his quote and look for clues here, it says forging against enemies, a global alliance, defending freedom. And now, okay, maybe the civil rights movement was about defending freedom, but it wasn't a global alliance forged against enemies necessarily. And then at the end, Kennedy is talking about serving the country. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Well, that wouldn't seem to apply so much with the civil rights movement, right? How am I going to serve my country via the civil rights movement? So the better choice here would be the Cold War, because I think what he's really talking about is potentially even fighting communism through military action, or at least having a commitment to resist communism on the global scale. So notice it's a combination of reading the text carefully, but also using a little bit of outside knowledge. That's what virtually all the questions are about. Let's take a look at another one. So once again, we'll read the notation first, just so we know where this is coming from. It's President Franklin Roosevelt, Fireside Chat, 1933. Now, hopefully, when you see FDR 1933, you're thinking Great Depression. So let's see what this says. 2 months ago, we were facing serious problems. The country was dying by inches. It was dying because trade and commerce, there it is, had declined to dangerously low levels. Prices for basic commodities were such as to destroy the value of assets of national institutions such as banks, savings banks, insurance companies, and others. These institutions, because of their great needs, were foreclosing mortgages, calling loans, refusing credit. Okay, so he's definitely talking about the Great Depression. Thus, there was actually, in process of destruction, the property of millions of people who had borrowed money on that property in terms of dollars, which had had an entirely different value from the level of March 1933. That situation in that crisis did not call for any complicated consideration of economic panaceas or fancy plans. We were faced by a condition and not a theory. Okay, so now we know what FDR was talking about. Let's take a look at the question. So this one is testing you on the New Deal. The New Deal is obviously related to what he was talking about, but the College Board is testing you on things that were not in his quote, right? This is your outside knowledge about the New Deal. So the New Deal included programs for achieving all of the following goals, except, well, let's eliminate things that we know are true. Like, for instance, you might think of the FDIC. The FDIC was designed to provide insurance of bank deposits so that people wouldn't panic about depositing money in the bank. It gave people a certain level of confidence, so we can eliminate that one. Did the New Deal provide unemployment? Yes, there were all those alphabet soup programs where people were hired to work on various projects like the CCC and civilian corps like that. So we can definitely eliminate D. How about stabilizing agricultural prices? Yes, actually, FDR got into a little trouble by trying to control agricultural prices too much, but that was definitely a goal of the New Deal. So process of elimination, it's got to be answer A. And maybe you remember that the interstate highway system was actually under Dwight D. Eisenhower, which was about 20 years after the New Deal. So this one is just outside of the era. So I always like to try to connect everything they ask to a specific period of time, because a lot of times they're just answers that are not in the right time period and you can eliminate them. In this case, we know A is the correct answer just because it wasn't in the 1930s, which is where the quote comes from. So when it comes to quotes and texts, if you know the speaker, that's always going to be valuable to you. FDR, obviously an important figure, and pay attention to the date, because the date is going to give you a strong sense of what happened during that era. But remember, there are secondary sources. So if the date is 2010, that's not going to help you with the historical era, right? That just means it's a secondary source written by an author later in time. Now, some of your questions may be related to non-text sources. These could be things like maps, cartoons, charts, graphs, you're going to see at least one cartoon on your test, maybe even a couple. The tricky thing about the cartoons is sometimes they can be a little hard to decipher. Um, by the way, if you saw a cartoon on your test, it would be much bigger than this one. So the College Board will try to make it readable, but I find, a lot of times these cartoons have a lot of things going on in them. However, the nice thing is they often give you a caption. So always read all captions associated with the cartoon because sometimes it will actually tell you what's going on. For instance, here we seem to see two old-fashioned guys, maybe from the late 1800s, early 1900s. They're dressed up in suits and a top hat. One of them looks like sort of a bullying character, and the other one looks like he's being bullied, right? And what does our caption say? It says, Hannah to McKinley. That man Clay was an ass. It's better to be president than to be right. Now, you might notice the name McKinley, right? We're talking about President McKinley. But even if you've never heard of this Hannah character, that's okay. We can see that if Hannah is talking to McKinley, then Hannah is the guy who kind of looks like the bully. McKinley, with his top hat, looks like he might be being controlled or bullied here. And if you've ever seen a picture of President McKinley, I think he was usually wearing a top hat, right? That was kind of his thing. Maybe not as big as Lincoln's hat, but guys like to wear hats back then. We had a question come in from the chat, which is, how many short answer questions do we write? Yeah, I covered this earlier, but let me just say it one more time. If you're taking the paper and pencil test, you will write a total of 3 short answer questions. One of those short answer questions is one that you get to choose from 2 options. That's paper and pencil. If you're taking the digital exam, you will write a total of 5 short answer questions. 3 of them will come after the multiple choice, and the other 2 will come after the document-based question. And unfortunately, you won't get to pick any of them. You'll have to just write on the prompts that are given. Okay. All right, so we've taken a look at our cartoon. We kind of get the sense that it's about McKinley. Let's see if we can do some process of elimination on the question. So the question says, the political cartoon above implies that. Okay, let's look at A. McKinley was the first president to favor big business interests openly. Well, this is kind of a trap if you're basing everything on outside knowledge, because McKinley was a Republican president and he did favor big business, but that's not exactly what we see in the cartoon. Unless you think that maybe Hannah is a business guy. But let's go back to it again, because what Hannah is saying is he's actually referring to Henry Clay. Okay, Henry Clay was not a businessman. Henry Clay was a politician. And he's talking about how it's better to be president than to be right. So there's no reference to business here at all. So A is kind of a trap if you're just basing this on outside knowledge and not really looking at the cartoon. How about answer B? By the 1890s, Henry Clay's political approach had lost favor with the electorate. Well, there's nothing really here about the electorate. I mean, Hannah thought that Henry Clay was a quote unquote ass, right? But we don't know if the voters actually thought that. There's nothing about that in the cartoon. So it's not going to be B. What about C? McKinley's presidential campaign was masterminded by Marcus Hanna. Well, masterminded might seem like a strong word, but Hannah does seem to be like talking down to him. He seems to be almost treating him like a child. So let's hang on to this one. And what about D? Marcus Hanna single-handedly controlled all 3 branches of the federal government. Okay, that sounds a little too strong. He might have controlled McKinley, but controlling all branches of the federal government, I mean, I think if that were true, we would know who this guy was, right? So our best choice is answer C, because that's really what we see in the cartoon. So I think the biggest job with the cartoon questions is just studying the cartoon carefully, looking at all the details and not rushing it. But The good news is you might not need a lot of outside knowledge because even if you didn't know anything about McKinley or Hannah, you could sort of figure C makes sense just based on what's in the cartoon. Now, you will definitely have charts and graphs on your test. As a matter of fact, you can even have charts and graphs show up attached to some of the essay prompts. And you definitely have charts and graphs that show up in the DBQ. So the College Board likes charts and graphs. What I like about charts and graphs is they usually don't require you to have much outside knowledge. You can usually base a lot of the answers just on what you see in the graph, but of course you have to study it carefully. So always read all the labels, all the keys, make sure you understand the chart. This one says average highest and lowest approval ratings by percentage of all eligible voters for American presidents from 1953 to 1974. Okay, so we see Eisenhower, his average approval rating was a 65, his high was a 79, his low was a 48. Kennedy, average approval rating 70, his high was an 83, his low was a 56. Johnson, average rating was 55, high was 79, low was 35. And then Nixon, his average was a 49, his high was a 67, his low was a 24. So we can see some patterns here. Like, I guess overall, maybe Kennedy was a little more popular than Eisenhower. Nixon definitely seems to be the least popular one here. Johnson kind of in the middle, right? So we see some patterns. So now let's take a look at our answers and our question, and we'll see what we can eliminate. So the question is usually worded like this. Which of the following conclusions can be drawn from the information presented in the chart above? So the key is do not use outside knowledge. They want you to base the answer just on the chart. So how about this one? Eisenhower was the most consistently popular president in the nation's history. Well, the reason I can eliminate that right away is because the chart isn't mentioning all of the nation's history. The chart is only looking at the presidents who were president from like the 50s to the 70s. So this can't possibly be right. It's way too extreme. Always be suspicious of answers that sound extreme in their wording. How about B? Kennedy received greater congressional support for his program than did any other president during the period in question. Well, they're mentioning congressional support. So this is where I would probably just go back to the chart and look at what they're actually measuring. They're not measuring congressional support, right? This is about approval ratings from voters. So I'm not even going to look at the numbers here because, again, the question is just not about the right kind of support. How about C? Nixon's approval rating was the result of the Watergate scandal. Okay, we can't use outside knowledge here because the question said, which of the following conclusions can be drawn from the information presented in the chart? So I probably wouldn't even look too closely at C because it wasn't in the chart. So the best answer must be D. The difference between Johnson's highest and lowest approval ratings was the greatest for any president during the period in question. Compare that with answer A. It says any president in the nation's history, too broad. This one only says during the period in question. And sure enough, if you go back to the chart, it's true that Johnson's highest approval rating was a 79. His lowest was a 35. The difference there is like 45 points or almost 45 points. And that's a pretty big gap. That's a bigger gap than we see with the other presidents because even though Nixon had the lowest low, he didn't have the highest high. So therefore, his difference was not as big. So again, you got to love the charts and graphs. You just have to be patient reading and studying the chart and make sure you're drawing your conclusions from the chart if they specifically ask for that. So I've given you a little overview of some of the types of multiple choice questions you can see on your test. Since this is our last live stream, I want to just leave you with a few notes of encouragement. First of all, you still have a lot of time to prepare. And So if you haven't already started your notes, start your notes. If you work on those a little bit every day, you're going to be fine by test day. And I also want to remind you to go to princetonreview.com and also call us at 800-2-REVIEW. Let us know how we can help. You might decide to do some AP tutoring. You might decide to check out a cram course. And don't forget about our excellent book, Cracking the AP US History Exam. We've just updated it for 2021, so it's up to date for the 2021 test. Thank you so much for joining me. And so good luck with the rest of your US history prep, and maybe I'll see you in the future. Have a good night, everyone.